Testing. There we go. Sorry, guys. Just give me 1 second. Oh, there we go. It's up. Great. Thank you guys all for coming. Thanks for the great applause. As Josh said, my name is Kyle Gray. I'm no one of particular importance in the firearms industry. I don't have any special certifications or anything. I'm just a student of firearms and history. So Josh and Kira invited me to come out, and I'm super excited to share what I'm passionate about with you guys. What I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight is just a very brief history of gun control in the United States, mostly at the federal level, a couple points at the state level. I could probably give a talk just on any one of these points, so please forgive how brief some of the points are, but I think it'll be an interesting story to see from the beginning. The purpose of this talk is simply, I hope you guys can walk away from here with a little bit more knowledge that then you can use to better subvert the state. And I just wanted to share, this is a quote from the man that made me a libertarian, Henry David Thoreau. Law never made men a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made the agents of injustice. So what I'm telling you is, whatever amount of respect for the law that you walked in here with, I hope I can relieve you of that burden. Okay, so I'm starting with the passing of the Constitution, the Second Amendment, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. This isn't necessarily, can you guys hear me okay? I'm talking at the right level on the mic, good. This isn't necessarily the beginning of gun control in America. There's a lot to learn and know. Again, this is a very brief history, so this is kind of the most important starting point. I'm sure you all are familiar, or hope you are, with the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," which obviously means that you should only be able to have guns if you're in a militia. So I'm going to skip forward a century to read a quote from the Supreme Court, which I think is important about the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms, this is from United States versus Cruikshank, 1876. "The right to bear arms is not granted by the Constitution, neither is it in any manner dependent upon that instrument for its existence. The Second Amendment means no more than it shall not be infringed by Congress and has no other effect than to restrict the powers of the national government." So I'll comment on that more later, but at least you have an idea of what the government thought about the Second Amendment in that time. So hopefully this makes you guys laugh. So for the first century after the passing of the Constitution, there was no no establishment of federal gun law. But there were a lot in the state level. I have to point out this is somewhat of a historically incorrect slide because I'm going to be talking about the 1800s, and the Klan didn't start wearing the hoods until the 1910s or 1920s. But they did exist in the 60s the 1860s. And throughout the 19th century, the states made it a point to try and prevent free blacks and basically any non-white people from owning guns. In 1820, only 8 of the 22 states at the time had language protecting the right to bear arms in their constitution. So as I mentioned, right, the Second Amendment is a federal law. That doesn't mean, or they didn't interpret that to mean that it restricted the states in any way. Prior to the 14th Amendment, 11 states explicitly banned the ownership and use of all firearms by blacks, whether free or not. Post 14th Amendment, so after the Civil War and Reconstruction, many states still found ways to disarm free blacks without explicitly mentioning race. So one example is Tennessee passed a law in 1879 that banned the sale of all pistols except very expensive Army and Navy pistols used by soldiers in the war. So you'll find parallels to that today where the state discriminates against poor people, basically, and keeping them from exercising that right. So again, this is kind of a brief history. There's a lot more to know about what happened in the 1800s, but I have a lot of points in the following century. Okay, so 150 years after the Constitution, 1934, this is FDR moments before a unfortunately unsuccessful assassination attempt. This and a lot of the gang violence that was going on at the time, St. Valentine's Day massacre, prompted the passing of the 1934 National Firearms Act. So this was the first federal gun control legislation. The National Firearms Act established a national registry and a $200 tax for fully automatic firearms, short-barreled shotguns, short-barreled rifles, and suppressors. At the time, $200 was equivalent to about almost $4,000 today. So it basically banned these from anyone but the ultra-wealthy or very wealthy. So today, an application to the ATF for an NFA-regulated item can take more than a year for approval, depending on what you're looking for. So suppressors specifically are like anywhere from 8 months to a year and a half, if you would like to legally own one of those. By the way, I forgot, if you guys have kind of questions, feel free to interject, and depending on it, I may address it further on or at the end. Okay, in 1939, I guess that would be 5 years later, there was a challenge brought to the 1934 National Firearms Act. Jack Miller and Frank Layton were bank robbers, and they were indicted for transporting a short-barreled shotgun across state lines. So at the time, right, in the Constitution, there is the Commerce Clause, which says the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce. And so the NFA at the time was interpreted to only apply to things that cross state lines. They filed a demur in court arguing that the NFA, the National Firearms Act, was a direct violation of the Second Amendment. The government said, hey, these guys are bank robbers. This is a great opportunity. We love the NFA. They knew that Jack Miller specifically was a known bank robber and had just ratted out his buddies in court and didn't have long to live. So they agreed with their point that it was a violation of the Second Amendment and that it would go straight to the Supreme Court. When it went to the Supreme Court, no one showed up to defend them. And the Supreme Court, Brandon's nodding because this is such a good story. The Supreme Court said, yep, it's not a violation of the Second Amendment, and that specifically the Second Amendment only protects firearms that are useful in wartime. This is another interesting part about this. Oops, sorry, I skipped ahead a slide. So two of the Supreme Court judges in the case specifically had World War I or experience in World War I, and short-barreled shotguns were in heavy use in World War I. You guys have probably heard of the trench gun, which is very controversial in World War I. That's what you're looking at in this picture here. So I don't think it was a very honest opinion from the Supreme Court. But this case specifically is used, kind of both sides use to support their case, whether you're pro-gun or anti-gun. The pro-gun side says, okay, well, they affirm that you do have a right to own military-like arms, and obviously it's illegal to use, or you have to go through the NFA, and their fully automatic firearms, which I'll explain further, are kind of de facto banned. So yeah, they say, you know, you can only use weapons of war, but you can't actually. Okay. This is, I love this picture. This is some real old school cool right here. This is the Black Panthers. Originally, by the way, the full name, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Yes, they were commies, but I think they, in fact, did a lot of cool stuff. And one of these was, this is the Black Panthers protesting the Mulford Act, which was in the California legislature at the time. This is them inside the Sacramento Capitol, which was legal at the time. And our favorite president, who was at the time in California, Ronald Reagan, said, "Oh man, these black people with guns are really scary, and no one should be allowed to carry a firearm in public like this." Quote specifically, "There is no reason why on the street today a citizen should be carrying loaded weapons." That's conservative hero Ronald Reagan. Boo, I agree. Also in either 67 or 68, Illinois passed their FOID, so their like registration license system, was also influenced by Panthers protesting and conducting armed patrols, cop watching. in the 60s. So you guys ever heard Maj Touré say all gun control is racist? He's right. Okay, hopefully I'm not going too fast. Skip forward another 30 years or so. This is Senator Thomas Dodd, I believe. In 68 was the Gun Control Act. So this was influenced by the assassinations of JFK, which was early 60s, but also Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, which both occurred in 68, I believe. Thomas Dodd worked on this, had been trying to get this legislation passed for a number of years, and I think the assassinations of RFK and MLK made this much more easy to pass. So the GCA banned the private sale of all firearms across state lines. It introduced the modern federal firearms license system. So if you want to buy a gun non-private sale today, you have to buy it from if you buy it from a store, a business, they must be licensed as an FFL. That comes from this act. It also banned the importation of firearms not used for sporting purposes. So if you're a firearms enthusiast today, you know there are lots of cool guns in Europe or in other countries that you can't get because of this act. Another interesting tidbit about this, in, one second here. So July 12th, 1968, there's a record in the Library of Congress where Thomas Dodd had his personal copy of a Nazi weapons law translated into English. And if you look at the Gun Control Act, there are literally sections that are lifted word for word out of that act. There's an organization called Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, very awesome organization. They did a lot of the investigation that I think uncovered part of this. So I highly recommend checking out their website. They have a ton of great history about the Gun Control Act specifically. And this, the word for word, kind of lifting from this Nazi weapons law. Okay, so for, you guys like this meme? For 2 decades after the passing of the Gun Control Act and the establishment of FFLs, the ATF basically spent time harassing, as they continue to do today, law-abiding business owners. A Senate subcommittee report from 1982 concluded that 75% of ATF prosecutions were aimed at ordinary citizens who had neither criminal intent nor knowledge but were enticed by agents into unknowing technical violations. So just like today. So that was the impetus for the 1986 Firearm Owners Protection Act, which did a lot of good things, actually, for the first time in the history of federal gun control. I know. It did several things. The one very important thing was it forbid the federal government from keeping any records that could link non-NFA weapons to their owners. So we talked about the 1934 National Firearms Act, established a registry for all items, but the 86 Firearm Owners Protection Act basically banned a federal registry for all other weapons. So this is a big misconception. A lot of people I talk to kind of think that when you go into a store, you fill out a form called a 4473, and they think that that form is registering their firearm with the federal government. That is not what's going on. Now, people will correctly say that when you fill out that form, depending on what business you're going to, they may keep a paper or a digital record, and the ATF is allowed to inspect those records, and sometimes if they're kept digitally, they'll just send the ATF, the whole history of their records, and it's, the ATF is a three-letter government organization. Of course, they're not following the law. So even though the law says that they can't have a registry, it's likely that there may be some sort of backdoor registry. But that doesn't stop you from going to an FFL who uses paper records, and in which case there's a much lower chance that the ATF has a record of your firearm. I don't know the exact answer to that. I believe that it is a certain number of years after they close the business. Do you know?
I can answer. When you close, you must send it, and they put it in the computer, so they have all records.
Yeah, exactly. So a sort of backdoor registry, even though it's technically illegal. The act. Sorry.
Bring your guns.
I agree. I'm going to get to that. Don't you worry. The act also limited ATF inspections to no more than once per year. So I think it really helped cut back on the harassment that was occurring. The one downside to FOPA was a last-minute amendment by William Hughes. It's called the Hughes Amendment, which banned the sale of all automatic weapons to civilians manufactured after enactment. I agree, thumbs down. So right now, if you want to own it technically is legal to own a fully automatic firearm in the United States, but you can only own one that was manufactured prior to 1986. And because you can't buy new ones, their price has skyrocketed, meaning...
What about a fully semi-automatic weapon?
That's a very different thing. But yeah, if you want to own a fully automatic rifle, you might pay anywhere from 10 to 50 grand. Okay. A few years later, there's a lot of stuff that happened in the 1990s. In 1990, the Gun-Free School Zones Act was passed by our favorite Republican, H.W. Bush. This banned the possession of firearms by unlicensed individuals on public property within 1,000 feet of a public or private school. So this is something a lot of people don't know about. There was, if you're licensed in the state in which you are at to conceal carry, then this doesn't apply to you. But so, for example, a lot of times states have reciprocity with concealed carry. I have a Utah concealed carry permit that, like, for example, Colorado recognizes, but I cannot carry, even though I have a Utah permit, I cannot carry within 1,000 feet of a school in Colorado. And the federal government uses that naivety on the part of some people to their advantage. I'm not positive about that. Does anyone? It does not. Okay. Okay. This is Randy Weaver's wife and kids. I wanted to talk about two events just shortly, even though they're not gun control legislation, Ruby Ridge and Waco, which I'll talk about right after this, because I think these both had a big influence on the culture, and I think prior to this, people had not as bad of a negative view of federal agencies in the United States, and these raised a lot of awareness of how awful the three-letter organizations are in the United States. So, and there's also a specific point about Ruby Ridge that I think is very interesting. So Ruby Ridge happened in 1992. Is anyone familiar with Ruby Ridge? Are you guys all? Yeah, awesome. So in almost 10 years before Ruby Ridge happened, the origins of what happened was Randy Weaver won a lawsuit against his neighbor over a property dispute. He won like three grand or something from his neighbor, and his neighbor was so upset about that he started writing letters to the FBI saying that Randy Weaver was plotting to assassinate the president. And that's how the FBI and ATF and other organizations originally sort of got interested in Randy Weaver. In 1986, Weaver sold 2 short-barreled shotguns to an ATF informant, so below the NFA limit, which I believe for shotguns is 18 inches. The ATF then said, hey, we got you by the balls. Please act as an informant for us to the Aryan nations. And Randy Weaver said, no, thank you. And the ATF said, well, we're going to screw you now. So that led to the 1992 standoff on his property where I believe it was an FBI sniper murdered his wife and son. Or the sniper murdered his wife, I believe, and then his son was shot on the first day before the first day of the siege. And his dog, thank you. Yes, a very sad story. So a year later, Waco, you guys are probably also familiar with this. 76 civilians burned alive after this disaster. Unfortunately, this is not David Chipman, for those of you who might think he is, but he's probably just as bad. If you guys are familiar with David Chipman, was a recent nominee to head the ATF. And we all thought that this was David Chipman smiling in the burning rubble of Waco. So I think both these events, right, I think are sort of important markers in gun culture at this time. A lot of people had a lot more respect for federal agencies before these two events. Okay, in 1993 and 1994, so the end of 93 and 94 are two other important bills. In 93 was the Brady Bill. So the Brady Bill established the national background check system. So before the Brady Bill, you would fill out your form to buy a gun, but there was no background check system, and now there is. And then 94 was the assault weapons ban. So this was part of Biden's 94 crime bill. If you guys have seen the videos of Biden in the Senate at the time, I recommend looking those up. Just fear-mongering people about violent criminals and stuff like that. The 94 crime bill was endorsed by Ronald Reagan, again, our favorite conservative. The assault weapons ban banned the sale of scary black rifles, basically with features that had nothing to do with lethality. You'll see stuff on TV where people talk about AR-15s and stuff being crazy deadly, right? And it's just the way they look. It has everything to do with the ease of use and handling, and very little to do with their lethality. So sometime after, the U.S. Justice Department studied it, and of course they're incentivized to say that it worked out greatly, but even the U.S. Justice Department admitted that the act basically had no effect on violent crime in the United States. So you can see this is just U.S. Mass shootings at the time, basically no effect. Okay, so I've made you depressed about U.S. gun control for the first nearly 200 years, just over 200 years. In 2004, I think something lucky happened. The assault weapons ban expired. It had a sunset provision. And I think this was the beginning in modern firearm culture. I think that after it expired, the popularity of the AR-15 skyrocketed, and the ubiquity of lots of different accessories and stuff like that you could purchase really exploded. And I'll talk more about that, but I think this is a very key moment. In 2008 and 2010 are two landmark Supreme Court decisions. So these are the wonderful individuals who said, okay, I guess we'll let you have your rights. So in 2008 was DC versus Heller. So the first time the Supreme Court acknowledged that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms unconnected to service in the militia. It struck down DC's handgun ban as unconstitutional. In response, DC enacted zoning ordinances banning firearm businesses and passed bans on bottom loading and semi-automatic handguns and rifles, continuing to make it impossible for the residents to bear arms. So as much of a win as it seemed like nationwide, at least for DC, it wasn't much of a win.
I just want to say that one of the attorneys that was instrumental in achieving that case, David Koppel, works in this building.
Oh, I did not know that. That's fantastic. Okay. I'm familiar with Alan Gurrow was the primary attorney.
Yep.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go Independence Institute.
What about revolvers?
What about what?
Revolvers.
Oh, those are, I believe, technically legal. So, but I think that, I'm not sure if they were, I think they were completely legal before that. So I guess you can now own revolvers in DC.
Okay.
So slightly better. In 2000, yeah. So in 2010, McDonald versus Chicago, the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment is incorporated by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and therefore enforceable against the states. So at the very beginning, I talked about the Second Amendment being, only limiting the federal government, right? And lots of states passing their own gun laws. So in after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was used progressively to incorporate amendments because people argued that the 14th Amendment basically says the Bill of Rights applies also to the states. And there are various ways that that was interpreted, but the Second Amendment was one of the last ones to be incorporated, I believe. Okay. 2013, the year gun control became irrelevant. This is, yeah, I'm a fan. This is Cody Wilson and the Liberator. This is certainly not the first, but I think the first popular 3D printed firearm. Single shot, probably not very safe, but Cody Wilson, definitely popularized the idea that you should stop listening to the government and just do things. And that whether the government likes it or not, this movement has allowed people very easily to build their own firearms. And I think that's awesome and what you should do as well. So just 6 years later, we went from the Liberator to this. This is the Fuck Gun Control 9, developed by a guy in Europe. So there's a great documentary, and I'm blanking on the name of it, about this guy and this gun. So this gun is made of like 90% 3D printed parts and unregulated in Europe hardware parts. So you can build this in Europe from unregulated parts. And literally the same year this was introduced, these have started popping up all over the world. I recommend checking out the Firearm blog does a regular column called Underground Arms Watch, and they find FGC 9s popping up all over the world, which I think is just phenomenal.
That documentary's on Vice if anyone wants to watch it.
What's the name?
I don't know what it's called, but I wouldn't call it great because the narrator is kind of like...
Oh, obviously.
I don't think this should be a thing, but it's still...
Yeah, the narrator is not a fan. But exactly, yeah.
If you look up Vice and 3D printed guns...
Yeah. The guy who developed this, I think his like screen name is J Stark something. So he's awesome. Okay. Some more positive news. So I've talked mostly about, or almost exclusively about gun control at the federal level. But this is a GIF of right to carry laws by state, starting in, this GIF will autoplay. Hopefully it'll go back to the beginning in a second. But 35 years ago, there was one state with unrestricted concealed carry. Now there are 21, and I think 22 to be coming soon. I live in Utah right now. Utah just passed, it's also called constitutional carry. So you can see, look at that, 16 states no issue, 20 plus states may issue. Now I think in 2021, there's 40 plus states that are either unrestricted or shall issue. Shall issue means that if you meet the certain requirements and you apply for concealed carry permit, they must give it to you. So I think it's really interesting. I think that it's very easy to get depressed about the state of the size and scope of the federal government. But guns and drugs seem to be the two things that are getting freer in some ways in the world. So I think that's pretty cool. This is another cheer up graphic for you. This is gun sales or national background checks from the NICS system over time. It's not per capita, but you can see it's absolutely exploded. And this only goes to, I think, the end of 2020. I think 2021 also set records. So the number of new gun owners, including minority and women, has absolutely exploded. I completely agree. Okay, so that's the very brief history, and now I want to talk about the lessons, I think, or what's to learn from that. The first is that in almost every case, you can see that the state uses fear to drive policy, right? So they scare people. The National Firearms Act passed after the attempted assassination of FDR. And a lot of the gang violence, the 1968 Gun Control Act after multiple attempted assassinations, and then the assault weapons ban and stuff in the 90s was all perpetrated by the government saying you should be afraid of other violent criminals. And the second is I think it's easier to take away something that not enough people hold dear. The American Revolution, I believe, was successful because it was fighting for something people already had. They were fighting to keep it being taken away, as opposed fighting to gain something. So I'm a believer that culture precedes politics. I'm sure some of you guys have heard that argument, and I think that is true when it comes to guns. So I think that if you want to live in a freer world when it comes to guns, the best way to do that is to push forward the culture. meaning if you have friends who are on the edge, take them to the range, help them buy a gun, educate them, etc. I think it's a lot harder to be afraid of a firearm once you've held it and fired it. I can't tell you the number of stories of people I know who, based all their opinions on guns based on stuff other people told them, but the moment, someone takes them to the range and shows them, hey, this isn't that like scary thing, all of a sudden they want to own guns. So I definitely want to recommend and encourage all of you guys who are gun owners, share that with your friends. Find the people who are on the fence and take them to the range. Put a gun in their hands and show them, hey, this is what it actually feels like, not what the government tells you.
The firing line range, I think that's the name of it, out on Potomac and Aurora, right next to 225 and north of Alameda, has Monday ladies fire free.
Awesome.
And every lady I date tends to go there. Early in that relationship.
That's a good place to pick up chicks. The second thing they want to talk about, so I touched on the 3D printing, and it's so awesome to see, multiple people in here who are apparently 3D printing their own firearms. It's so easy now to pick that up. So I'm a big believer that a very effective approach at ending the state is to make laws unenforceable. Sorry? Yes. I think that the easier it is for people to manufacture their own firearms, the more they'll be likely to own guns and to push that forward and to start to ignore federal and state laws. So I cannot encourage you more. If anyone is interested in 3D printing, it sounds like there's a couple guys who want to help you. I would also love to help you. I have a 3D printer at home. Had a lot of fun with it and learning a ton of stuff, and would love to help anyone out who's interested in it. Let's see.
Build them and they won't come.
Yeah, so that's my talk. Do you guys have questions? What about the bullets? That's an excellent question. That's actually in the 3D printed firearms community. There are multiple projects about that. I think it's called like What About Ammunition or What About, because that's an excellent point. There are people working on like 3D printed shells, I think. I'm not sure how, when I say shell, I mean like in place of the brass case. I don't know about making your own powder yet. I'm not educated in that area, but I know people are working on that very hard. And I think there's, I seem to have missed my links at the end of this presentation. Oh, no, I've got them here.
There's kits to do that. Like, I remember people going to the Renaissance Fair and making their own ammunition. Like, they're like,
Well, okay,
The components are like sold out everywhere. So
Yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of loading your own ammo,
It's hard.
yeah.
Yeah. But at least in the U.S., ammunition is mostly unregulated.
so pretty sure in Europe, Jay Stark is making his own 9mm,
That's awesome.
and that is the most like,
Restricted.
highly regulated,
Yeah.
restricted place in the world, and so it's not easy.
But you can do it.
It's doable,
Yeah.
and they are pushing it all the time.
Yeah, there's also a guy working on a really cool like pneumatic machine gun, basically, so it wouldn't require powder and
Suck like 20.
Yeah. There's so many. I've got some links up here for you guys. I'll just go over them real quick, and we'll talk about 3D printing again in a second. I think I missed a couple of notes. Hopefully a lot of you guys know. It seems most people know that the NRA sucks. The 1967 Mulford Act, so the act that banned open carry of firearms in California as a response to the Black Panthers, was supported by the NRA. There were multiple other gun control legislation that was supported by them. Firearms Policy Coalition is, I think, what a lot of people want the NRA to be. FPC is doing amazing work. They're suing the government in like all the states. I don't know the specific details, but I highly recommend I donate to them. If you have money, I recommend donating to them and going to their website and seeing what projects they're involved in. The same goes for Gun Owners of America. Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership is a much smaller organization. I don't think they're doing anything legally right now, but they have a lot of great history. I talked about the 68 Gun Control Act and how that was lifted from Nazi legislation. There's a lot of good reading on that website. Open Source Defense is a blog. It's one of my favorite blogs on firearms culture. I highly recommend. A lot of good learning on there. ControlPew.com. Sorry, I thought someone was going to say something. ControlPew.com is a great website to get into 3D printing of guns and gun parts. There's a guide and links to everything else I think you need there. There's a few more. You guys can, if you're curious, come over and talk to me. And there's deterrencedispense.com, I believe, the catalog.
Second Amendment Foundation.
Yeah, Second Amendment Foundation. Second Amendment Foundation was involved with DC versus Heller, right? If I remember correctly. Yeah, sorry for not. Oh, Guns for Everyone. Yeah, so. I believe so. Defense Distributed is Cody Wilson's organization, which has been continually wrapped up in legal battles, which is kind of like not the point. Deterrence Dispensed, I think, was sort of born of just people in the community who wanted to keep innovating and doing stuff without worrying about, DefCat kept taking stuff off their website because of this suit. But people said, hey, I'll just make my own website and post stuff. So Deterrence Dispense currently hosts a lot of their stuff on Library. If you guys are familiar with Odyssey or Library, it's a decentralized sharing. It's mostly like a video platform, but you can host files on it, and so you can find everything you need on Library.
So it's the same in spirit, I guess you would say.
Yes, absolutely.
Not in actual.
Yeah. All the good stuff is happening on Deterrence Dispensed.
So and the catalog is Cody Wilson's like baby down the road.
Okay.
You can get any file you want, and it's $50 a year, but you're supporting a good cause.
Yeah.
It literally is. He basically said that if you pay for something, it's legally something else, and so he's doing the same exact thing he's doing in 2012.
Yeah.
Library and Odyssey are great though. You can get like 98% of the files if you don't subscribe to catalog.
Yeah.
How effective and reliable are 3D weapons compared to their like traditional counterparts?
That is an excellent question. I think very reliable. It depends. I think that, there's a lot of learning involved, and 3D printing, there's just, so many variables in terms of like making something. But if you get those variables right, I think you can make pretty reliable stuff. Surprisingly, with plastics that aren't even that good. Most people print with PLA and PLA Plus, which are basically, I would consider like the easiest and very easy to print with. I think you had the lower that is printed in PLA Plus. Yeah. I've been trying to work a lot in printing with nylon recently, which is a lot harder to print with.
There's carbon fiber 3D printing. There's other stuff called PEEK.
Yeah.
Material.
PEEK is really, really high temperature. That's
but
super
it's
hard.
good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't there a method of using doing it in metal, like powder?
Yes. So I think someone mentioned there's a way where you can 3D print like a mold, 3D print it, create a mold around it, and then you melt the plastic out. It's called like lost PLA or lost plastic casting. I think that in general, casting is kind of tricky to get right in terms of porosity and stuff like that. So I haven't seen like in the community a lot of really successful attempts at that. It doesn't mean it's not happening, but I'm sure it'll be improved too.
How do you see governments trying to fight this, like through legislation or anything else? Do you foresee anything?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they're trying and they will. But I think the part that makes me happy is that whether or not they do it, people are going to keep printing guns anyway. One of my favorite examples of, I think, pushing culture forward and making it easier for people to ignore bad laws is BitTorrent. If you guys remember, 15 years ago or whatever, like you're a kid, like you're downloading music on LimeWire, like that wasn't legal. But everybody did it. Why? Because the risk of enforcement was very low. And the more people who are doing it, the more you're like, oh man, the risk can't be that bad. And yeah, they got some people, right? There were some people, some poor teenagers and kids or moms or whatever, who got absurd fines and went to jail over it, which I don't want to happen to anyone. But culturally, it couldn't be stopped because it was so easy. And I think that's what's going on with 3D printed guns.
It got stopped because the market made it easy. Steve Jobs and iTunes made it easier to do that.
They reacted to it, yeah, but it still happens. Like everyone BitTorrents.
So there's already been comments from politicians about
Yeah.
So that would be the way that they keep people from 3D printing guns is by requiring background checks on barrels and
Yeah.
slides and shit like that.
Yeah. So to expand on that, one thing I didn't really cover is that the way that firearms are regulated in the United States today, it's usually a specific part, the frame or receiver, that is considered by the ATF as the firearm. So today it's wildly popular to like buy all the parts separately for a gun, especially for AR-15 and Glock style weapons. You can for a Glock, you would buy the lower frame, and that's the regulated part. So if you order that online, you have to have it shipped to an FFL and go through a background check. But everything else, you can order straight to your door: the slide, the barrel, the the parts kit and stuff like that. And that's why you're able to do this so successfully, right? It's not like the whole gun is plastic. And so what he's saying is that like the ATF has they just had a comment period where they're of a proposed rule where they want to regulate all those parts like individually as firearms. So if you want to buy a barrel, you have to go through an FFL, your slide, et cetera, which will certainly make it a lot harder to 3D print guns. But the FGC-9, which I showed, like I said, you can make that from completely unrelated parts. So the barrel is a pipe from a hardware store that they use electrochemical machining to rifle. Very, very cool. So. Yeah, so the Ghost Gunner is like a desktop CNC mill, very, very cool. You can theoretically like CNC mill just like complete aluminum blocks, but it's also designed to finish 80% receivers. So an 80% receiver is something the ATF considers like if you're a manufacturer of a gun, there's like lots of different stages, right? And up to a certain point of manufacturing, the ATF doesn't consider that a rifle. So there's a couple companies, Polymer 80 is a really popular one, where you can order an unfinished frame to your doorstep without going through an FFL, and if you have a drill press, you can like finish it. And the Ghost Gunner is allows you to do similar stuff for like a broader range. So that's another avenue of getting around the law.
Do you foresee the actual like OBJ or STL files becoming illegal?
Absolutely. Will that stop anyone? No.
Doesn't that become a First Amendment issue as well too? Like it's not the actual gun, but
Yeah, the entire point, right, is that the government absolutely will and has the power to try to enforce, but like when the community makes it like so easy for people to print, it becomes very, very difficult for the government to enforce it.
Well, like with the files becoming illegal, though, that's why it's important now. Everything's available
Yeah.
right now. Like even if you don't want to start right now,
Download the files.
go online and just fill
Yeah.
up a terabyte hard drive with
Yeah. Yeah.
print files and just let it sit in your closet.
Yeah.
Post it on tour.
Yeah, you guys are all familiar with crypto. It's the same with crypto, right? Like, people don't have the same respect for the law when it comes to crypto. So, I agree.
I just gotta say, I'm a child of the 60s, and grow your own just sounds so familiar.
Yeah, I agree.
Speaking of free speech, isn't that how Cody Wilson won against the state? Didn't he win on free speech grounds?
Oh, man.
Got everything dismissed. Didn't the feds pay for his lawsuits?
His case is like very complicated, and I don't remember the details exactly. Is anyone? No. Yeah, he was in jail shortly for.
if the government hates you and some like 15-year-old comes to you, don't have sex with it.
No, he talked on.
That's a good rule.
He said on Thad's.
You shouldn't do that whether the government hates you or not.
Yeah.
He was on a website.
No matter what.
Yeah.
SugarDaddy.com.
He said on Thad's podcast, he's like, yeah, I kind of deserve this or whatever, and he's a weird dude. But
Any last questions?
Sorry, it has nothing to do with free speech, but
yeah, that's okay.
so you mentioned that a lot of the laws and the cultural perceptions in the gun sales has to do with reactions. And
Yeah.
so I was just curious, like, if the government's trying to like shape the culture and stuff, what do you think the role of like media clearly sucks, but like what do you think the role of like social media in shifting people's perceptions?
Oh, man.
Gun sale trends and everything.
That's a great question. I think social media has been absurdly influencing in propagating gun culture. So I think today you can go like all over Instagram, Facebook, and you will see like rabid mocking and antagonizing of federal agents. with like meme culture. No one has any respect for the feds anymore, all because of like social media, like meme edgelording, and it's great. I think that people's like attitudes matter, and like no one respects federal agents anymore. Yeah.
Are there, following up on that question, are there good social media, I want to say like, I don't know, marketing campaigns, for lack of a better word, oriented towards popularizing gun culture? Like, hunting is a direction in which that is. Are there other sort of directions in which there's a cultural campaign to popularize gun ownership?
So I would say like the one that I'm the most familiar with is just sort of like, I would say it's like adjacent to the 3D printing culture, but just like general young people's interest in firearms, like against the state, like for use against the state and for self-defense, and sort of just like mocking the feds and stuff. I'm not a hunter myself. I know plenty of people who are hunters, and then I think there's a lot of kind of overlap in those areas, but it seems to me to be very grassroots. Yeah.
I just want to say on that front, I just saw an article that said for the first time in about 20 years, there's been an increase in Colorado hunting licenses being bought. So we're turning a corner, I think.
Yeah.
Gun control. I think the next generation is a lot more open to firearms and firearm culture. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
What is the funding? What is the funding the United States government giving the Afghani people $83 billion worth of our highest tech equipment done for the gun culture here in the United States? Because it seems like that is a counteractive to our Constitution.
I absolutely agree. I've seen lots of memes about people, saying, "Oh, I wish I were." So what?
I said, thanks for the opium.
Yeah. Exactly. I think JD had a.
JD and then Frank, and then that's it. Okay, Frank's the last question.
Frank first, go ahead.
Here, just a pitch for Independence Institute master program to teach parents and teachers to be armed in the classroom. Here at Independence Institute, that's a push. See me for details.
I've gone through both of their courses. They are amazingly informative, fun, and I would suggest, if you have kids in schools, I would suggest talking to your school administrator and seeing how they feel about their staff training to be prepared for if the worst should happen. So yeah, thank you, Frank.
Lorna Carno is the coordinator of it here.
She's a badass.
Give me some hope. Australia's now on 3D.
I don't think 3D printers are illegal in Australia, but I think culturally it doesn't matter. Australia's probably gone. So F in the chat for Australia. Sorry. What'd you say, Andy? Oh. Yeah, I mean, there's hope in the U.S. for sure. In Australia, I think there's no hope.
I have a friend in Northwest Territories in Australia, and I guess they're like almost seceded from the rest of the country.
Yeah,
They're not part of the Commonwealth, and he said he has guns.
That's awesome.
So, I mean, that's probably a way more rural area than.
Yeah, I think being rural is really helpful. I had a friend in college who was from Russia, and her parents grew up under the Soviet Union, but they lived very rurally. And she showed me pictures of her family from the 70s or something, and her dad had hunting rifles and stuff. Yeah. So I think living in a very, very rural location is helpful, even in the worst of times.
That's our talk. Give it up for Kyle.